White House, where U.S. President Donald Trump has signed tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and...
We start in the U.S., where President Donald Trump is sending 1,500 troops to the Mexican border to boost security.
Vast amounts of fentanyl have poured into our country from Mexico. And as you know, also...
U.S. President Donald Trump is delaying tariffs on imports from Mexico for a month. Its President Claudia Sheinbaum says. She spoke to Trump on the phone earlier today.
It's more than just trade disputes. What's happening now between the U.S. and Mexico could be described as a modern economic Cold War. It's a conflict that has quickly moved beyond tariffs and immigration control. The issues are deep-rooted and multifaceted, touching sectors that are critical to both countries. The stakes are high. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has warned that Mexico will not submit to any impositions that threaten its sovereignty. Her bold stance has been widely perceived as a rejection of American dominance in the region, signaling that Mexico is no longer willing to follow U.S. directives without challenging them. As tensions rise, one thing is clear. Mexico has made it known that it will stand firm, even if it means escalating this dispute. The fight may not yet be a full-scale trade war, but both countries are taking positions that could lead to a much larger conflict. Mexico's independent stance is shaking the foundations of U.S. influence in the region. On the other side, the U.S. is scrambling to respond. President Donald Trump, in an attempt to assert control, has already sent 1,500 troops to the Mexican border. His goal? To tighten security and combat the increasing flow of illegal migration and drug trafficking into the U.S. from Mexico. Trump's hardline stance against Mexico isn't new. Over the years, his administration has frequently clashed with its southern neighbor on a wide range of issues, but the recent decisions made by both parties have turned the conflict into something more dangerous, an all-out diplomatic showdown. This goes beyond just migration and crime. Mexico's economic retaliation has the potential to inflict significant harm on critical U.S. industries. It's clear that this isn't just about security or border control anymore. This has become a high-stakes game where both sides are fighting to maintain their influence, and Mexico has shown it will not back down easily. Mexico is not backing down. In fact, it's leveraging its position in the global supply chain to drive home its point. While the U.S. may have long been the economic powerhouse, Mexico's role in key sectors is undeniable. For instance, Mexico exports nearly 80% of its goods to the U.S., and in 2024, trade between the two countries surpassed $800 billion. Yet, Mexico holds power over several sectors that the U.S. cannot afford to ignore. Automotive, agriculture, and oil. These are the sectors where Mexico has the strongest leverage. If Mexico chooses to slow down or even halt the supply of critical components for U.S. manufacturers, it could bring the American automotive industry to its knees. Companies like Ford, GM, and Chrysler rely on Mexican-made parts for their vehicles. A disruption to this supply chain would mean costly delays and losses. The automotive sector is especially vulnerable. The U.S. depends on Mexico for automotive parts, and an interruption in this supply could impact production across the nation. The economic consequences would ripple through the entire U.S. economy. Automakers, retailers, and consumers would feel the squeeze if Mexico decides to impose tariffs or export restrictions. Agriculture is another arena where Mexico holds powerful cards. From California to Texas, the U.S. agricultural industry is heavily dependent on Mexican exports. Whether it's fruits, vegetables, or meat products, the U.S. imports massive quantities from its southern neighbor. What would happen if Mexico decides to impose tariffs or export restrictions on these goods? The price of food in the U.S. could skyrocket. Imagine paying more for fruits and vegetables, or even seeing empty shelves in grocery stores. The impact on U.S. consumers would be immediate, and the political ramifications could be profound. But there's more. Mexico could also target migrant labor, which is a critical workforce in U.S. agriculture. Many seasonal workers cross into the U.S. from Mexico to work the fields. If Mexico were to tighten border controls or even halt the flow of labor, the U.S. agricultural sector could face a severe labor shortage, making it harder for farms to operate. This issue of migrant labor has been a sore spot between the two countries for years. As much as the U.S. may want to restrict immigration, it's reliant on that very flow of labor to keep its agricultural economy running. Without it, the consequences would be disastrous, particularly for states like California and Texas, which rely heavily on migrant workers for their agriculture. It's not just about food and cars. The energy sector is where Mexico's influence could really shake things up. While the U.S. has its own oil reserves, it is heavily reliant on Mexican crude oil for its refineries. In particular, U.S. refineries depend on heavy crude oil from Mexico, and without it, the U.S. could face a supply shortage. What if Mexico decides to reduce or even stop this flow of oil? The U.S. energy market could experience a significant supply gap, which would likely push gasoline prices higher. This wouldn't just hurt businesses, but also the everyday American consumer. Imagine the effect on voters' anger as fuel costs rise and prices surge across the economy. Mexico has long been known for its policy of nationalizing its oil resources, and if President Sheinbaum's government chooses to prioritize domestic consumption, the U.S. could find itself at the mercy of Mexico's oil exports. This would have major implications for the U.S. economy, especially in regions dependent on affordable energy prices. Another powerful weapon Mexico holds is geography. The U.S. and Mexico share a vast border through which millions of dollars worth of goods flow every single day. If Mexico decides to tighten trade at the border, the U.S. logistics and retail sectors could be severely impacted. Long waits at the border could delay shipments of everything from car parts to groceries, potentially bringing the U.S. economy to a halt. In the worst-case scenario, supermarkets could face empty shelves, and businesses reliant on smooth border operations could find themselves in a nightmarish situation. The U.S. economy could grind to a halt as border delays disrupt supply chains and logistics. Even if Mexico doesn't stop trade altogether, a gradual slowdown in the flow of goods could lead to significant bottlenecks at the border. And in today's global economy, timely delivery of goods is everything. Any disruption, no matter how small, could lead to serious economic consequences, especially in industries like automotive, retail, and manufacturing. Perhaps the most politically charged issue between the U.S. and Mexico is migration. For years, Mexico has acted as a buffer zone, preventing migrants from Central America from reaching the U.S. border. But President Sheinbaum has now made it clear that Mexico will no longer shoulder this responsibility. If Mexico decides to open the gates, the U.S. could be hit by a mass migration crisis. Tens of thousands of refugees from Central and South America could flood into the U.S. This would not only create a humanitarian crisis, but also a political one, as Trump's immigration policies would be immediately tested. The idea of a migrant wave arriving at the U.S. border would undoubtedly trigger outrage in America. Trump has spent years pushing for border security, and if Mexico backs off from its role in controlling migration, the situation could become untenable for the U.S. government. The tension between these two leaders is escalating quickly. President Sheinbaum's actions are challenging Trump's authority in ways that could have far-reaching consequences. From trade policy to migration, Mexico is asserting its sovereignty and national interests, and it's doing so at a time when Trump's political future could be at stake. The political ramifications of this conflict are huge. Trump could face significant backlash from voters in border states like Texas and Arizona, where the economy is tightly connected to Mexico. Trump's supporters are already calling for tougher measures against Mexico, but Sheinbaum's firm stance may ultimately create a political crisis for the Trump administration. So, what comes next? The economic, diplomatic, and political pressures between the U.S. and Mexico are only going to escalate in the coming months. Mexico has strategically positioned itself as a major force in this confrontation, and it's not backing down. The question now is, how will Trump respond? Will he escalate the trade war, impose more sanctions, or attempt to rebuild relations with Mexico? On the other hand, Sheinbaum's government might continue to harden its policies and push back even more. One thing is certain, this tug of war between the two countries could reshape the future of North America, with both sides unwilling to back down. It's a new era in U.S.-Mexico relations, one that could last for years. As the diplomatic and economic tensions between the U.S. and Mexico continue to escalate, Mexico is diversifying its energy strategies while facing complex water disputes. Mexico's state-run oil company, Pemex, has been under increasing pressure due to the U.S. tariffs and trade policies. In an effort to mitigate the risks of relying too heavily on the U.S. market, Pemex has begun seeking new opportunities in global markets, positioning itself to reduce dependence on its northern neighbor. The recent threats of U.S. tariffs have forced Pemex to reimagine its business strategy, with a clear shift toward diversifying its export channels to Asia and Europe. By looking beyond the U.S. for new energy markets, Pemex is attempting to cushion itself from the adverse effects of potential trade barriers, signaling that Mexico's energy sector is ready to take a more independent path. This move could have significant implications for the U.S., as Mexico's oil exports are crucial to U.S. refineries, particularly those on the Gulf Coast. A reduction in these exports or a shift to other markets could lead to a disruption of U.S. energy supply, forcing U.S. companies to seek alternative sources of crude oil at a time when global demand is volatile. Mexico's energy diversification plans could disrupt U.S. energy markets, leading to increased costs and supply chain instability for the U.S. In addition to the energy sector, the U.S.-Mexico relationship has also been tested by a water dispute over the Colorado River. Mexico has requested a special delivery channel for water from the river to alleviate shortages in the border city of Tijuana. However, the U.S. has denied this request, citing concerns about water scarcity and the impact on American agriculture, particularly for farmers in the Rio Grande Valley, who depend on the river's water for irrigation. Under the 1944 Water Sharing Treaty, Mexico is obligated to share water from the Colorado River with the U.S. But tensions have flared in recent years over Mexico's failure to meet delivery commitments. This shortfall is particularly problematic for American farmers, who are seeing their crops suffer due to insufficient water. In light of these growing pressures, Mexico's denial of water delivery requests has exacerbated the situation, further straining an already delicate relationship between the two countries. This issue has reached a boiling point, with President Sheinbaum vowing to address it through diplomatic channels. The potential fallout from the water dispute could further complicate the already tense situation at the border, particularly as both nations are wrestling with significant environmental challenges. The U.S. refusal to grant Mexico's request is seen as a political move to protect its agricultural interests, yet it also signals deeper long-term issues that could shape the future of U.S.-Mexico relations. The water dispute over the Colorado River underscores the broader tensions between the two nations, with environmental resources becoming a new battleground. These developments mark just another chapter in a growing divide between the U.S. and Mexico, with energy and water resources now at the heart of the conflict. As Mexico continues to assert its sovereignty over critical sectors like energy and water, the U.S. finds itself struggling to adapt to a reality where its economic dominance is being challenged by a neighbor that is no longer willing to be a passive partner. Mexico's strategic diversification of energy markets and its determined stance on water rights not only threaten the U.S. agricultural and energy sectors, but also underscore a wider geopolitical shift in North America. With both countries facing difficult economic and environmental pressures, the next few years could see even deeper conflicts as these key issues unfold. The question now is how the U.S. will respond. Will it double down on its existing policies, or will it find ways to address Mexico's grievances? Only time will tell whether these emerging disputes will escalate into a full-blown geopolitical crisis, or if diplomatic efforts will bring about a resolution. One thing is certain: the relationship between these two nations is being reshaped in real time, with consequences that could echo for decades to come. The U.S. could be hit by a mass migration crisis. Tens of thousands of refugees from Central and South America could flood into the U.S. This would not only create a humanitarian crisis, but also a political one, as Trump's immigration policies would be immediately tested. The idea of a migrant wave arriving at the U.S. border would undoubtedly trigger outrage in America. Trump has spent years pushing for border security, and if Mexico backs off from its role in controlling migration, the situation could become untenable for the U.S. government. The tension between these two leaders is escalating quickly. President Sheinbaum's actions are challenging Trump's authority in ways that could have far-reaching consequences. From trade policy to migration, Mexico is asserting its sovereignty and national interests, and it's doing so at a